Would you rather have a treaty where one or two major spacefaring nations disagree and then don't go with it? Or would you rather have a set of guidelines which took as long as any treaty to negotiate, but at least they were born with the shared political will of all member states who are involved?
Hey, SpaceWatchers, this is Space Café Radio, your channel about trends, awesome events and interesting people in the space sector. I'm your host, Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global. And today we have lined up a special discussion with a distinguished guest. Joining us is Aarti Holla-Maini, the Director of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, UNOSA. With decades of experience and a keen eye on space sustainability, Aarti will shed a light on critical topics like space security, traffic management, and the evolving role of private companies in the space sector. Buckle up as we dive into the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead in our quest for a peaceful and sustainable space environment. Hey Space Watchers, and welcome back. The entire space sector had a very busy restart after the summer breaks, but we are not slowing down, and so the world politics and the diplomatic activities. Today, it is my great pleasure to have a long-term inspirator and supporter of our SpaceWatch.Global mission in our Space Café Radio studio. A very warm welcome, Aarti Holla-Maini, Director of UNOSA. How are you doing, Aarti?
Thanks, Thorsten. Very glad to be with you again. It's been a while since we could actually sit down and have a conversation, so I'm glad to have this opportunity.
Wonderful. No, I'm looking forward to that. So let's start it. And I know that will be not that easy, but we will make our way through these. So we see UNGA, recent resolution on space sustainability, security and traffic management. What immediate steps are critical to begin implementing these guidelines as we have them now?
So I guess that you're referring to the Pact for the Future, which was adopted at the beginning of the 79th session of the General Assembly at the end of September. And there we saw 193 member states of the UN at the highest level adopting a pact, which includes an important paragraph on the peaceful uses of outer space. And specifically, the heads of state have really called on COPUOS to do a couple of things. One is to address critical issues like space traffic, space debris, and space resources, but also to reflect on holding a space summit in 2027. And those are 1 in 25-year events. And historically, if you think of Unispace 1, 2, and 3, which have happened in previous years before I was in this office, they have been catalysts for important actions and outcomes. For example, from Unispace 3, we saw the UN Spider program be born, and we also saw the establishment of the International Committee on GNSS, so on satellite navigation systems. So going forward, we've got some really important work to do to prepare for a Unispace 4 in 2027, but also really important work to make sure that the committee is able to address the critical topics of space sustainability. Some of them it's already doing. For example, space resources. We have a space resource working group, and that's right now focused largely on the celestial body moon and what we will do in the future with ice, helium-3, regolith, and other resources that can be found on the moon. But there's also space traffic and space debris. And so we as an office are really stepping up our efforts to make sure that the committee is equipped to deal with these issues because they are necessarily technical and complex.
Absolutely. And I would like to stay a bit on this resolution that you just mentioned. The resolution stresses also on the equitable access to space resources, and you just mentioned that, and many more. But how does the UNOSA plan to ensure that space benefits support the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals for all nations? Because I know that's very important for you and your work.
Absolutely. I mean, part of our mandate is very much to be the gateway between space technology, data and services on the one hand, and the needs of member states on the other. And more often than not, those needs are all to be found back in the Sustainable Development Goals. They're captured in some shape or form, whether it's to do with agriculture and food security, whether it's to do with water management and sanitization of water resources, whether it's to do with healthcare for all, education for all, or even partnerships for the goals. you can find space and space solutions being relevant to absolutely all of the SDGs. And we take our responsibility really seriously to make sure that developing countries in particular have access to the technology and services that they need and that they know how to use them. But also we want to make sure that they have a voice and that they are heard when it comes to space governance discussions. I've said before that you don't need to have a satellite or even a space agency to care about space governance and space sustainability. On the contrary, as soon as you know that you rely on space services to some extent or other, that's enough for you to have a legitimate and an important voice in the debate around space governance. Torsten, I would go back to the consultation period with member states when I was new in this office just over a year ago. While many member states gave us their different priorities and expectations, all of them, even the smallest countries, mentioned that space sustainability was a priority. And that was quite surprising because we thought it would be the major spacefaring nations or other more developed countries who would talk about that. But this is the one priority that literally every country mentioned, which tells you that they do already realize that they need space services and solutions, and they probably already rely on them to some extent or another.
How would you, and you mentioned the Pact of the Future before and the SDGs. So is my assumption correct that the Pact of the Future is building on the SDGs? And with the SDGs, we are half time now because they're meant to be 2030 implemented or so.
Yes, so you're right. We are halfway there. And in 2025, UNUSA will be doing a midterm review of where are we on the space contribution to achieving the SDGs. So I think that Secretary General Guterres, when he initiated the Summit of the Future process and the Pact for the Future, the journey towards the Pact, he did so realizing that we are halfway to the goals and there is a certain number of areas where we really won't make progress without multilateralism. And space was identified as one of those areas because the SDGs are for all, and therefore space sustainability, which is the crux of the operative wording of Action 56, which concerns space, is also vital if we're going to leverage space solutions for achieving the SDGs.
Let's move a bit further to our current situation that we are facing when we are watching news. Space security concerns are mounting, especially around potential militarization or weaponization, or however we want to call it, in the dual-use domain. What concrete actions do you believe are needed to maintain space as a domain for peaceful cooperation?
I think the first thing that I would say is that UNUSA and COPWUS, our mandate addresses civil space matters, but obviously we can't ignore the fact that space remains a realm of dual-use technology. We have the UN Security and Disarmament bodies supported by UNODA, the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs, and they are deliberating various approaches related to space security, but there is a difference in approach between member states. Western countries, on the one hand, have led efforts to focus on the development of norms for responsible behavior so as to avoid misperceptions, state-on-state behaviors. Russia and China, on the other hand, have led effort over the last few decades to try to negotiate an international treaty on the prevention of an arms race in outer space and the first non-placement of weapons. Ultimately, states have not been able to agree on definitions for space weapons and what constitutes an arms race in the conventional sense. But what can we do? I think UNUSA can continue to make the case for space as a critical national infrastructure to start with, not least of all because it is essential for so many of the sustainable development goals. And I think, for example, the experience during the pandemic highlighted that really well. So we had certain people who had exceptions to travel, and satellite engineers were one of them, because the importance of communications and communications infrastructure was realized as so critical. At that time, it was to ensure that the government could spread and disseminate relevant knowledge to citizens no matter where they were, but it was also because of the feeding back of diagnostic information and testing information back to HQ. As I said, we can continue to make the case for space as a critical infrastructure for governments. And quite frankly, an intentional act to destroy a satellite or space objects would have disastrous impacts for space safety and security, putting the very services that we all rely on in complete jeopardy. So we really hope that countries recognize this. And I think that the work that we're doing and also the attention which is coming back on the SDGs now, especially with the midterm review in 2025, will help to remind everybody that is really the priority. That that is what should be driving us more than all of the geopolitics and unrest that we see all over the world.
You know me well enough that I'm a very careful listener of what you're saying, and you just called for putting space into a critical infrastructure. And I think that's very important, and I absolutely share your view on that. But I see that from few countries, including Germany, they don't do that. They see how important space is, but putting it into a critical infrastructure needs different safety measures, needs different efforts to prevent it from attacks. And that includes, obviously, costs. And I have the feeling that countries don't want to go this extra step for it. I'm not sure how you perceive that from the member states at large.
Torsten, you know very well that I come from the satellite communications sector. And when I worked for the satellite operators, we were very cautious not to promote satellite communications infrastructure as critical infrastructure for the simple reason that satellite operators don't want more regulation on them. And as soon as you are classified as a critical infrastructure, that has certain consequences, as you said. Does it mean an increasing cost? Possibly. Is it worth it? Probably. But I think already the recognition that space services have received and are continuing to receive, whether it was for communications during the time of the pandemic, like I spoke about earlier, or whether it's space data and imagery because of increasing severe weather events and more severe impacts of climate change that we are seeing all over the world because of sea level rise and so on. I think what really counts is this recognition and understanding about the importance of space and satellites and satellite ground segments and so on as critical. There's another dimension, which is this question of satellite systems being used increasingly for government services and secure communications. That is probably enough for governments to want to classify it as critical infrastructure. But I don't know. I don't think that is a dedicated dialogue that has happened between satellite operators and governments because of secure communications. So far, secure communications was one business line for satellite operators among a whole range, and it hasn't been a driver by itself so far for that kind of a conversation.
I'm really glad that you mentioned previous experience before the job at UNOSA, because my next question goes in that direction. So we see a rapid rise of satellite constellations and satellites in space. Space traffic management has to become urgent. There's no way around. It's urgent. So what key elements are needed in this global framework to prevent orbital congestions?
I think there are a few different elements here. One is we need more operators, be they public or private, to share information about their space objects. When are they going to be performing maneuvers and so on and so forth? Right now, only some operators do. And we know that the more space data we have, the more information we have on where objects are, the safer we can make space and the more accurate will be the conjunction warnings that are received. So that's one element. And that is something which is being recognized very clearly in the UN long-term sustainability guidelines, which were adopted in 2019 by consensus. They call specifically in guidelines B1, B2, B3, they call upon operators to really share this kind of information to contribute to safer space, basically. But those are just recommendations and guidelines. So what needs to happen? Two parts. Number one, we need to see guidelines or parts of those guidelines being embedded into national regulatory framework. And this probably comes down to telecoms operators who are giving satellite operators licenses. They could look at some of the recommendations and embed them as conditions for those licenses. That's one thing that could happen. And I think we need to help telecoms regulators who were not involved in the craft of those guidelines or not directly involved. We need to help them understand how the guidelines relate to their work. And that's part of what UNOSA is planning on doing. A second part, however, is we can't just say that it's all about moving from paper to practice and implementing the guidelines. Part of the problem is that a global space traffic coordination system actually requires a multilateral process. That's not down to individual national implementation. That's where the Pact of the Future wording and COPUS discussions again become very relevant. We know that there are many national systems. There's even a European regional system in EUSST. And I'm sure we will continue to see a lot more investment going into national capabilities. But we also know that none of these systems will become a successful global system. There are various reasons for that. Some will be technical, some will be political, there will be geopolitical concerns. concerns with that. But fundamental to all of this is also trust. If you want operators, public or private, to really proactively participate into a global system, then you need to make sure that system is born of a multilateral process where all member states are on an equal footing, have an equal voice, and that the process is driven by consensus, not by voting, not by what the majority of the room wants. If everybody says you need a new global treaty, would you rather have a treaty where one or two major spacefaring nations disagree and then don't go with it? Or would you rather have a set of guidelines which took as long as any treaty to negotiate, but at least they were born with the shared political will of all member states who are involved? So when it comes to space traffic coordination, I think this is something where we have to create a platform so that the individual national and regional systems we are seeing can come together and coordinate to be more than the sum of their individual parts. And that's a conversation that we have started facilitating already.
On that same note, the other issue in the realm of traffic management is space debris. It is a growing hazard to all space activities, without any doubt. So how is UNOSA addressing this challenge, and what role do private companies play in creating a sustainable orbital environment? Because you already mentioned the more dominant role of private companies in this entire scenario here.
There's two sides of space debris, right? One is mitigation, preventing more debris in the future, and one is remediation, which is removing existing debris. It's very easy for people to assume that those who are launching the most objects into space now are responsible for the debris which is in space now. And that's not necessarily true, certainly not yet. In fact, most of the debris, especially the larger objects that we see in space, are due to more than 5 decades of historical launches into space. When it comes to mitigation, we see lots of initiatives which are going to help. The Zero Debris Charter from the European Space Agency. So that's one thing. We have different initiatives on circular economy and on trying to prevent debris, putting docking plates onto future objects that are launched, or other mechanisms. There's a lot of innovation happening in that space. But I think remediation is equally important, if not more important. And that means removing space debris. What is shocking for us is, even though everybody knows, because we hear the numbers all the time about the amount of space debris which is in space, when you talk to on-orbit servicing companies like D-Orbit, ClearSpace, Astroscale, they'll all tell you, but there's no market for ADR. And that just sounds absurd. We know that it's private companies, perhaps with institutional investment as well, but it's still down to private companies who are in the forefront right now to develop these solutions. And they need to accelerate and they need to invest more. How do we expect them to continue to invest more if they don't see a tangible market? So that's an area where UNOSA is trying to step up. We're trying to help identify a potential market by engaging with member states, but without asking them to make any commitments, obviously. That's one important aspect of it. I think the other comes back to guidelines, regulatory guidelines. We know that there is New Zealand, Japan, and the UK who all have guidelines for licenses for on-orbit servicing in place. So this is an area where COPUS doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. And I'm trying to work with Japan and New Zealand to bring more knowledge about the homework that they did, which involved thinking through the legal implications, the need to discuss with other countries and other governments across borders, because you're not just going to be launching from one country to bring that country's satellite back down, right? It's not necessarily like that. It's very much more complex. So we're trying to see if we can't help bring that knowledge to COPUS so that COPUS can springboard off that to drive some kind of global consensus around guidelines for a license for on-orbit servicing. And I think that's also going to provide then regulatory certainty, which also goes directly to enabling more investment. Operators have always said, give us certainty, don't create uncertainty in the regulatory environment. And when we know that we have a framework in place, that contributes to creating the best conditions for more investment.
If I'm not mistaken, in one of the previous IISL Moot Core competitions, there was a similar example that when you do a service and something goes wrong and the satellite does not belong to, it's complicated at the end of the day. And as you said, we need this kind of regulatory framework to have the certainty of what we are doing. Let's move a bit forward here. The space divide is still stark between the spacefaring nations and the rest of the world. So with limited access for developing nations, usually. I think almost a year ago, you brought up the space bridge, the UN space bridge. So what role do you see the UN space bridge playing in promoting equitable access, sustainability, security in space, and especially for countries with emerging space capabilities?
The USB was launched as a vehicle for UNUSA to foster a useful dialogue and bring different stakeholders together in a less formal setting to address specific questions. So, for example, we convened our first UN Space Bridge last week in New York around space traffic coordination. We brought operational experts from both industry and governments together to discuss where are there areas of commonality and not. So it's not really about bridging a space divide in a sense. It's a vehicle with which we can promote a conversation in a less formal setting than COPUOS itself. But your question, I think, is more about the space data divide, perhaps, the space solutions divide, and the fact that so many developing nations still don't have the tools that they need in order to deal with so many of the SDG challenges that they face. So there, it's not really a role for the UN Space Bridge per se, but a role for UNUSA to really ensure that developing nations can have affordable, equitable access to the solutions they need. A lot of that is to do with information, so capacity building. Many countries don't know that solutions are available. And even if they do, they don't know how to access them. And then, of course, they have concerns about how do they afford them. We have, through our UN SPIDER program, which stands for Space-Based Information for Disaster and Emergency Response, we've already supported multiple countries in having much more affordable access to satellite imagery and high-resolution satellite imagery than they could have done alone. We've significantly reduced costs for them. I don't have any notes in front of me, so I don't have any concrete examples to give you. But I think it was Zambia, but also Sudan. They had quotes from private operators in the millions. And by leveraging our position as United Nations organization, and also by tapping into certain framework agreements that we have in place with private operators, we were able to reduce the cost for those countries by orders of magnitude down to hundreds of thousands rather than millions. So the role that we can play is significant. We are going to play this not just for developing nations, but also for the UN system at large. We know that there's more than 25 UN entities who are all procuring space data and high-resolution imagery independently under a single-use license, completely inefficient. And many of these agencies are now looking to us and saying, you're the space people, why are you not doing this for us? So that is something we're exploring as well. Of course, the prime driver for us is the demand and the requests that are coming to our office from developing countries and from the global south. So yeah, we have an important role to play there, and we're doing our best to give the global south countries access to the data that they need. And it's very often high resolution because that gives them actionable intelligence, but also capacity building. So training them how to use it once they have it in their hands.
Very interesting development. We are doing now a bit of an outlook, looking to the next World Space Forum in Bonn in December. What are your main objectives for advancing international policies on sustainability, security, and, as we just discussed, space traffic management?
You know, we don't have that many opportunities to meet with the COPUOS delegates outside of the formal COPUOS meetings. We do, however, certain events during the year, and the World Space Forum is an important one, which does bring COPUOS delegates together, even if it's outside of Vienna and in a different setting. So this is a very important event for us. And you asked about key topics of sustainability, security, space traffic coordination. You know, these are all areas where even though we've been talking these challenges for a long time, still actions that we are taking are actually moving quite fast. It's an opportunity for us to inform and update member states on the work of the office and engage them to help them understand what they can do. And I think when they sit in COPUOS, it's quite a dry environment. It's a very formal setting. And it's easy to think that this is just some kind of a political or academic exercise. We want member states to realize that the work they do there is so real. It is so important for space safety. We're going to be informing them about our space sustainability program for COPUOS delegates. and about our UN Space Sustainability Days that we'll be doing in January in Vienna here, just before the STSC.
Great. So my last question, and I know it doesn't get easier. So as the space economy expands in rapid speed, as we can see it day by day, how can you and OSA balance innovation with responsible practices to make sure space remains accessible and beneficial for all humanity?
So I understand that question as meaning there's so many startups, so many companies working on new space projects and innovations. How do we make sure that they all prioritize sustainability? And I think one thing is we're very fortunate that sustainability is rather fashionable these days. Okay. There's a lot of attention on it. Every company is being asked, what are your practices? What are your ESG practices? We even see investors making this one of the criteria for their investments. So I think that's really important. The only thing that UNUSA can do is continue to raise awareness of the importance on this, engage more private sector entities in dialogues and conversations on this, which is not obvious given that COPUS is primarily a member state driven, it is a member state driven process, but we are in a parallel track trying to engage industry, whether it's startups, whether it's companies who are working on lunar activities, or whether it's companies who are working on SSA and space traffic activities. We're engaging all of them in different settings to keep them focused on what needs to happen next, calling on them to work with us.
Great. Thank you very much for your interpretation of this question. Aarti Holla-Maini, thank you very much for your time. I know that's hard to find a spot in your busy schedule, and good luck for the things that are on your table.
Thank you so much, Torsten. Great to be with you again.
And if you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Torsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.